Hey Gators, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701 Research Methods in Criminology, and we are working on Lab 7 together. So this is a lab where we're going to be doing a lot of different things, so make sure you've set aside time to do this lab, but we're going to be doing it step by step just as we have done in other labs, so keep that in mind. First, take a moment to go ahead and open up apps.ufl.edu and launch SPSS, and then you'll be ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and close this first window. This is just a prompt to open a file. You don't necessarily need to use the prompt. You can go ahead and close it. So I'm going to do so. I'm going to get my blank untitled data editor open in a little bit bigger format so I can see more at once. So I'm going to stretch out the sides of the screen. And then we're going to go to File, Open, Data. Now we're going to go ahead and navigate to the AdHealth dataset. I actually save a copy on just the regular documents folder, but let's go to the place you're normally used to going to, which is the R drive. So we're going to scroll up and go to Common Files R, and then go to Courses and select your course. And then Data. And then you'll actually see, I can make this a little bit bigger too so you can see more at once. You'll actually see a lot of different data sets in here. So the data set you want to open for this lab is here. It's called the AdHealth Waves 1, 2, 3, 4 merged file. So this is essentially the file that contains all the waves 1 through 4. So remember, wave 1 started in 1994 when everyone was ages 11 to 19. And then 4 years later, wave 2 was collected in 1998. Everyone was a little bit older. And then 6 years later, wave 3 was collected in 2004. And then 4 years after that, when everyone's now in their late 20s, early 30s, the last wave was collected in 2008. There actually is a fifth wave out there, but it has not been released yet, that they collected in 2012. But this is some really great data. We've worked with it in class. Let's open it up. So we'll let SPSS retrieve that file. There it is. Okay, so this lab, we're going to be building a delinquency scale. Some of you may even be using something like this for your research paper. So this might be kind of handy to use. And I've always received the question, hey Jensen, we built a variable in a lab and I'm using the same data set. Can I use that variable that we used for a lab for my final paper? Absolutely. Why duplicate your efforts? So yes, you're welcome to use the variable we used in a lab, as long as it fits your purpose for the paper. So I tell people, remember how it was built. They'll have to go back and document how you did that variable and how it was organized. And if it fits your purposes of what you were going to measure and your whole topic, then certainly you can use that variable. All right, so here we are in the data view. Again, lots of variables. Don't get overwhelmed by 8,000 variables in AdHealth, right? There's lots to choose from, but we're not analyzing all of them. We're just analyzing a couple. So go ahead and click on the Variable View tab, and we're going to look at some variables that could be really, really helpful. So let's scroll back up to the top of the data set. We're going to build a delinquency variable in wave 1 when they first start asking kids about their behaviors. So a place or a trick that I use to get to that place where they start asking those questions about delinquent behaviors is I do a Control Find, Control F, and I type in the word graffiti. So you type in Graffiti. Okay, that's how you spell graffiti, Graffiti. Remember, graffiti is spray painting something that's in a non-artistic way. It's very subjective, but we're going to start with graffiti, and that's essentially the vandalism that we see delinquents do quite a bit. So if we go to that point, we hit Find Next or Enter, we will find the very first instance that graffiti turns up. So I'm going to close this Find and Replace. And you can tell right in here, that's where graffiti is. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. In this section, we have a whole list of questions that ask about delinquent behaviors. So they start here with H1DS1, and they go all the way down into H1DS15. So let's take a look at a couple of these questions to see if they are what we have in mind. So first, in the past 12 months, have you painted graffiti? In the past 12 months, have you damaged property? Have you lied to your parents about your whereabouts? I don't always like using that question because I think that's actually pretty normal teenage behavior. I don't necessarily think you're a delinquent kid if you lie occasionally. But of course, if you lie a lot, then we start getting into other problem behaviors. But I think it's kind of funny that they included that question on the survey because I think that's just part of keeping things from mom and dad. And I think that's actually pretty normal teenage behavior. But again, you don't want to do a lot of that because there are risks to it, right? Shoplifting, being in a serious physical fight, having seriously injured someone, running away from home, stealing a car. In the past 12 months, have you stolen something worth more than $50? Have you burglarized a building? Have you used or threatened someone with a weapon? Have you sold drugs? Have you stolen something worth less than $50? Have you taken part in a group fight? And that kind of gets into more gang behavior. Have you been loud or rowdy in a public place? Okay, so those are kind of our delinquency behaviors. Now keep in mind, delinquency includes regular offenses that we examine as part of criminal behavior. So it'll do an examination of property crime, damage to property, or theft. You also have violent crime like assault, rape, etc., robbery. And then certainly we have status offense behaviors. So if you're going to do a delinquency variable for your research paper, you might want to keep that in mind. Status offense behaviors are behaviors that only kids can commit because of their status of being young, right? So these are things like running away or being truant or underage drinking. So I always recommend to use a few of those behaviors too in a delinquency scale because they are unique to kids. And the reason we have them as status offenses is they often lead to other problematic behavior for a kid, or they put them at risk of also being victimized or getting into other delinquent trouble. Okay, so these are our sets of variables we're going to use. There's quite a few of them. And this is where we get to make decisions on, okay, do we really want to use that variable? How much mileage are we going to get out of it? And, are we covering mostly property stuff? Are we doing some violence? So you want a variable that has a lot of good variation to it. So you're not just capturing the violent kids, you're also capturing the kids that are damaging property, or, and people say, well, what about drugs? We haven't even talked about drugs or prostitution or some of these other kinds of behaviors that kids can get into as well, because sometimes they have sex with other kids to get access to drugs or money. And those sorts of things. So certainly you can add those to a delinquency scale, but again, it depends on how you want to measure delinquency and what behaviors you're after. So as we can tell, all of these behaviors are in separate line items. They're all separate questions. They all represent delinquency, just different elements of delinquency, right? So together it's delinquent behavior, but they're not measured together. They're all measured separately. So we have to build a scale to put them together. Let's do that. All right, so remember, I always teach you never analyze what you don't know. So at this point in time, you would want to go through the code book and really look at all of these items to see how they are worded and if they're really meeting your criteria, because you may make decisions about some that don't fit or some that maybe aren't really worth using. But like I said, these are pretty good as far as coverage. You get property crime, you get violent crime, you do get a few status offenses in here, you'd get the running away from home. But like I said, you may have other ones you want to add, truancy, underage drinking, and things like that. There actually are whole sections of the survey that talk about that. So just down below a few rows, it talks about, having your first sex, and did you use drugs, or were you drunk when you first had sex? Drinking alcohol behaviors. Have you gotten into fights while you've been drinking? And then down here it even says, have you shot or stabbed someone? Have you had a gun or a knife pulled on you? So some of this has to do with witnessing crime or being a victim of crime. Have you been in a fight while high? Have you been jumped, right? So again, there are lots of variables that you could really get into when it comes to this type of topic. So if anything, give yourself some time to go through the data to make a variable that's going to work for you. Okay, so now you're thinking, oh my goodness, Jensen, are you really going to make us recode 15 different variables just to make one delinquency scale? Yes, but we're going to do it in a way that's really fast. So I'm going to teach you how to mass recode these variables so you can do them all at once. It saves you a lot of time. But first, let's run frequencies on these variables. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and highlight all of these. And we'll right click and ask for descriptive statistics. So it's actually going to run descriptives on every one of those variables we just highlighted. Okay, so you have to highlight them by kind of clicking on the row so you get the entire line. Okay, so I'll show you that one more time if you haven't done that before. I'm going to go ahead and close my output. Okay, so again, click on the row where the row number is, where this says 1802. You click on that, and then you just keep, whoops, we don't need to go all the way over. You just keep going down until you get to your last item. And once you have these highlighted, again, you just right click and ask for descriptive statistics. And it'll give you frequencies on all of those variables. Okay, let's look at your output. Let's see what we have to work with here. I'm going to expand the output a little bit. There we go. Just grabbing the edges and pulling it down so we can see a little bit more. All right, so we start at the top. Again, you kind of get a big bar that says these are all the variables you just ran statistics on. Not terribly interesting. We have a minimum, maximum, a range, a mode. Not necessarily really what we need to see. We want to see the actual responses inside these variables. So if we scroll down, our first variable is painting graffiti. So here we can see that the responses are never, 1 or 2 times, 3 or 4 times, and 5 or more times. And then we have a whole bunch of missing data below. Refused, don't know, not applicable, and a total. Okay, again, these numbers here are the frequency of how many people responded that response category. The percent, the valid percent is just the responses we can count, the ones that are not missing data, and the cumulative percent that eventually add up to 100. Okay, so here's our graffiti. We have damaged property. And you can tell as we go up to 3 or 4 times or 5 or more times, we're getting into lower and lower numbers. For people to have damaged property 5 or more times, not as many people do that because of the consequences and the risks. So you'll see as the responses go up that the numbers get smaller, which is what we would expect. Lying to parents about your whereabouts. Yep, that's kind of what we expected on that one, right? Shoplifting, getting into a serious physical fight, seriously injuring somebody, running away from home, stealing a car. Yes, there are kids in this data set that have stolen a car. And keep in mind, this is wave 1. This is ages mostly 11 to 17. And there are a couple of 18 and 19-year-olds in here. And then we have stealing something worth more than $50, burglarizing a building, threatening with a weapon, selling drugs, stealing something worth more than 50, or excuse me, less than 50, taking part in a group fight, and being loud or rowdy in a public place. Now this one you go, really? I mean, that's like going to the Saturday night football game at the high school. Yeah, you could argue that, but this kind of gets more into, are you loitering? That's a status offense for kids. Is there a whole group of you where you're being loud and obnoxious and kind of getting in the way of an event or a store owner or, you know, creating some criminal mischief and mayhem kind of a thing? So that's kind of more of what we're after in that question. And you usually only see it with big groups of juveniles. You don't see it with big groups of adults very often. So it is very much a status offense. So here are all 15 of the variables. Now you've probably noticed they're all coded the same. So we can apply the same coding scheme if we want to organize them all the same way and mass recode them all at once. They all use these same items, never 1 or 2 times, 3 or 4 times, 5 or more times, and the same kinds of missing data as well. So we just have to use this information to put this into our coding scheme of old values and new values, and then apply it across 15 variables. Let me show you how this is going to work. All right, so remember to get into recoding. We already looked at the frequencies. We already checked what the responses were, but the next thing we need to do is get a sense of what those value labels are. So let's go to that first row of the paint and graffiti where we have the whole list of everybody, right? Well, let's go to that first row here, and we're going to click on, remember the invisible blue box at the edge of the values column? I'm going to hold down my cursor so you can see it really well. Yes, don't you love buttons you can't really see? So we're going to click on that so that we can show those value labels. All right, so here we discover that we coded all the responses to this question in a certain way. We have 0 representing never, 1 representing 1 or 2 times, 2 representing 3 or 4 times, and 3 representing 5 or more times. And then we use the number 6, 8, and 9 as essentially missing data categories: refused, don't know, and not applicable. So those would be responses that we can't really analyze because there's really not a lot of information there to analyze. So at first glance, we look at a variable like this, and they're all coded the same way. And we might say, okay, what kind of variable is it? Is it nominal, ordinal, or interval, or ratio? Now, it would be easy at first glance to say, oh, it's got to be interval because I see a number of times, and I know that interval and ratio variables are quantities, and it gives me an amount of how much something happened. So this has to be interval ratio, right? Nope, it's not. This actually is ordinal. And then some people might say, well, it looks like there's categories of how much something is happening, like once, 3 or 4 times, 5 or more times. That's a category, right? Yes, it is a category, but it gives us a little bit more. So it's more than a nominal variable. It's definitely not an interval variable. What we have to look at here is actually an ordinal variable. So because we don't have a distinct amount, we have a response that covers 1 or 2 times, 3 or 4 times, and we have 5 or more times. They could have done it 20 times. We wouldn't know. We would just know that they did it 5 or more times. So we don't have an exact quantity of the number of times that they did it. That's why this variable is not interval or ratio. It's also not necessarily strictly nominal because we still have a sense of more or less, right? So it's not just you're in the once or twice category versus the 5 or more times category. You're actually in a category of having fewer times versus a category of having more times. So not only do you have a category, but I can determine whether your delinquency is higher or lower or more or less. So this variable is, by definition, an ordinal variable. So all we're really going to do is we're going to take all of these different questions that talk about stealing and vandalism and violence and drugs and all these things. We're going to sum them all together into a scale where we can see how much of all of this stuff this kid is doing. So yeah, they're not quantities right now, but we can turn them into basically delinquent acts that give them points for committing one or more of these different types of offenses. That's what building a scale is all about, is you're taking lots of different kinds of items or topics and pushing them together to illustrate a larger topic. So we can't just let selling drugs or running away from home or threatening someone with a weapon by itself represent delinquency, because delinquency has a lot of behavior in it. So we'd rather get a sense of how delinquent a kid is by all of the different behaviors that a kid could do. And the more of that behavior a kid does, the more delinquent they are. So again, we wouldn't be so quick to call a kid delinquent that literally just carved up their desk at school. And they could answer, yes, I damaged property. But they may not really seem like a delinquent kid. They had a bad day that day, they damaged some property, but that's really all they've done. We'd call that kind of petty criminality. It's kind of a one-time offense, it's someone being bored. If they did other things too, like participating in a group fight or selling drugs, you'd say, okay, we're starting to get into more and more behaviors that are unsettling and a little bit troublesome for this kid and this kid's community. And they're going to be headed more toward being classified as a delinquent, right? Because they're doing more and more things that are illegal. So we're going to pull all this behavior together into a scale, and this is how you mass recode it. So now that we have this list, what I like to do, and I encourage you to do the same, is to get some note paper, and it can be a Post-it note if you want it to be. It can be a notepad or some scratch paper from your printer or even an electronic document, and actually get this information in some kind of list, okay? We're going to develop a coding scheme. So I have a Word document right here that says, okay, I'm going to build a delinquency scale, and I'm going to move myself up a little bit so I can zoom into this and you can see it a lot better. So here are the 15 items that I'm going to put in a delinquency scale. So I have kind of my notes of these are all the items I'm going to use. This is the coding scheme as it exists right now. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, and 9. never, a few times, 5 or more times, and so forth. For purposes of this lab, we're going to keep things super simple. I'm just going to say, hey, if you've done it once or more, we're going to say that's basically indicating a yes answer or a point towards your delinquency. If you haven't done it, we're going to say that's more of a 0, or no, you're not being delinquent in that area. So that's essentially what we've set up right here. So we're going to take the nevers, and we're going to say if you've never done it, you've never done it. You're not going to get a point on that scale that's going to score you high as a delinquent person. It's not going to contribute to your score. If you've done it once or twice, then yeah, we're going to give you a point. If you've done it 3 or 4 times, yeah, we're going to give you a point for that too. Or if you've done it 5 or more times, yep, you get the idea. You're getting a point on the scale. Now, this is where some researchers are really creative, and they say, hey, if the kid's done it 5 or more times, then that kid is super delinquent. That's a really big deal, especially when it comes to the violent stuff, right? That's very, very serious behavior. So some researchers will say, I want to give that kid 2 points for that. If they've done that behavior 5 or more times, then let's make them score even higher, because that's pretty serious to have done it so much in the last 12 months. That's a big deal. And you can do the same as you code variables for your research and for your paper. You could certainly make some items worth more than others. So maybe some offenses are seen as more petty to you and not very serious, but others are quite serious, like selling drugs or being violent or assaulting somebody. So you could actually make the point scheme higher or lower for those items. You wouldn't be able to mass recode them like we're doing in this instance, because then basically your values would take on different points. And so you'd have to recode each of those by hand according to how you want them scored. But essentially, you could give them different weights, if you will, to contribute more or less to the overall score. But again, to keep things super simple, we're just giving everyone 1 point apiece for basically, are you doing it or not? So we're setting up a 1 versus 0 scenario. And then here, we're taking all the rest of the responses, the refused, the don't knows, and the not applicables, and calling them missing data. So this is the coding scheme you're going to use in Lab 7 for this variable. So let's get back into SPSS and show you how it works. And it's good to keep this handy too. All right, so jumping back in here, we're going to go to transform, and then we are going to recode into different variables. We have to prepare these variables before we sum them together, okay? So we're going to go ahead and stretch this out a little bit so we can see things a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor inside this field and right-click and say Display Variable Names, okay? And then remember, the variable was H1DS, so I kind of start typing H1D, and it takes me to that little place in the survey. We're going to have to scroll down a little bit, see if I can get there a little quicker. H1, let's see, H1DS. Oh, it's tough to find these guys. Let's see. They're just not necessarily sortable by how the researchers coded all the names. We'll go down a little bit further. There's a whole list of them though, so we should be able to spot them pretty seriously. And by the way, these P questions, those are parent questions. So as soon as you hit those, you know they're coming soon. H1. Let's go back up. I might have gone too far. There they are. Okay, so they are, sorry that took so long. They are here. So look at about where my cursor is in the scroll bar, and that can kind of give you a little bit of a sense of where you're going to find them. One other trick you can do is you can even rename these variables by typing over the variable name. And some people like to do that. They put like a Z in the front of the name so they can do a sort. if they do an alphabetical sort that's ascending to descending, then they know that the variables with a Z in front of them actually are going to be at the end of the list. So you could actually rename them and sort them and then always be able to find your variables. Okay, so essentially, we're going to highlight all 15 of these variables, okay? 1 through 15. So H1 DS1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way down to 15. And we're going to put all of them into the variable Qer, okay? So we'll start up here with H1 DS1, okay? And now the trick is with mass recoding is you still have to name them individually, but at least you don't have to do the scheme over and over again, okay? So this first one, we're going to call this, let's see, paint graffiti recoded. And again, I have to use underscores in the name because SPSS does not like spaces. And honestly, I can just use that same name. I can copy paste it and paste it into the label. Okay, so I just did paint underscore graffiti underscore recoded. Okay, then I'm going to click on old and new values. And remember, we're going to use the coding scheme that I brought up before, which is right here. So again, it's good to kind of have this nearby so that as you start working through a recode, you're able to kind of say, wait, what was that one again? And you have your notes. So again, the old value of 0 is going to be a 0, and we'll hit add. And now here we can actually do a range. Okay, so we can do a 1 through 3, a 1, a 2, or a 3 is going to be treated as a 1. Okay, and hit add. Let's just double check our coding scheme. A 1, a 2, or a 3 is going to be a 1. Yep, right there. So again, range is kind of handy on this one. And then you could literally do another range. 6 through 9 is going to be treated as missing. So let's do that. 6 through 9 on the old value, and over here in the new value, we're going to treat as system missing and hit add. Okay, and then finally we're going to do system or user missing, treat as system missing. Again, blanks and non-responses, that's how it takes care of that. And hit add. So this should be your coding scheme when you're finished. 1 through 3 is 1, 0 is 0, missing is system missing, and 6 through 9 is also system missing. Okay, we can hit continue. And now our coding scheme is in place. And we can hit change. Okay? Now basically all we have to do is come up with a name for all of these, and then I'll show you how to mass recode this. It's super fun. Our next variable is damage property. So I'm literally just going to type damage property, got to spell it right, and recoded. So again, I remember what I changed versus the original. Okay, and again, I just kind of, all I do is I kind of like click a few times to highlight the entire name, and then I can right click and actually say copy that, and then I can paste it down here. Okay, so watch this. If you're still on this H1DS2, if you go to old and new values, all your stuff is still there that you just put in there. It's going to follow the same scheme, and all the values are the same with the kinds of responses in that variable. So we can click continue and literally change. Now that variable's done. So that's all you're going to do is you're going to keep going one by one and just typing up the name so that SPSS knows what to call the new variable. This next one is lie. I'm not going to write out the whole thing. I'm just going to say lie recoded. And again, you can highlight it and copy it and paste it. And we're going to apply that same old and new values and hit change. And then DS4 is shoplift recoded. So all we need to do is just put names in here, and then essentially you have everything you need. And change. DS5 is serious fight recoded. I'm going to use the same thing for the label. I don't have to get super fancy with the labels because we're not going to use these more than building a scale, and hit change. Now I'm on number 6, And this is injure, if you seriously injured someone. So I'm just going to put injure recoded and paste it into the label and hit change. Now I'm on 7, and this is running away. Run away, recoded, copy, paste it, change. DS8 is stealing a car. And again, if you want to do this on your own, you can pause or fast forward me and apply the same scheme as well. The next one is stealing, I'm going to call it more than 50, recoded. And then hit change. H1DS10 is burglarizing a building. I'm just going to put burglary for short, recoded. Paste that into the label, hit change. We're almost done. So here we have threaten with a weapon. I'm just going to put threaten recoded to keep it simple. I know what it means. And hit change. And then we get to DS12, which is selling drugs. Recoded. And again, I just paste that into the label because it's faster. And then number 13 is steal less than 50. So this is more petty theft. I like to use all caps. It doesn't really matter. You can use lowercase too. It's just easier for me to read because of the kind of font this is, especially with things like I's and L's. They kind of look alike. And ones, right? 14 is group fight. This is kind of gang stuff we're getting into. And again, we can paste that in the label. And our very last one, loud and rowdy. I'm just going to call this loiter recoded because that's essentially what it is. Have you been loitering? And change. Okay, so now we can see if we click on any of these that they're all named, they're all labeled, and they've all been changed. So literally, we are done recoding 15 variables. It only took us a couple of minutes rather than over an hour. So if we click OK, you'll see that there's some syntax below that shows that those recodes were made. And you're like, well, where's my variables? You got to run a frequency to see them. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to your variable view. And we'll scroll all the way down to the bottom. And you can now see there are your 15 variables that you recoded. Starting here with painting graffiti, damaging property, lying, shoplifting, being in a serious fight, injuring somebody, running away, stealing a car, burglary, etc. It's all there, okay? Now notice these guys do not have value labels, okay? We have not applied the value labels yet to these variables. We would need to do so, putting in those ones and zeros, okay? This one you can also kind of do en masse if you want to. You have to use syntax to do it. And the syntax is a little bit tedious to type up. And I found that in many cases, it's really just easier to just type in the yeses and nos. It's actually a little bit faster. So I actually just clicked on that invisible blue button right on the edge of the value label. I just did the very first one of painting graffiti. I'm going to do the second one, again, clicking on that edge of the column of the values. And then I'm going to type in a value of 1 is a yes in the label and hit add. A value of 0 is a no and also hit add. So once I have those in there, I click OK. That variable is labeled. So quickly go ahead and add your value labels. It's the same thing kind of over and over again. Like I said, you can use syntax to do this en masse, but there still is a lot of typing. So to me, I don't know that you really save that much time. So it's probably just faster to do it this way. And sometimes students will say, Jensen, why do you bother labeling everything? And I said, because I often will start and stop research at different times. And if I don't label things, I'm going to forget what I did. And if I pick up where I left off the next day, I don't have to worry about being disorganized or trying to remember everything that I just did. I can say, oh, there's my recoded variables. There they are. Now remember, when you're doing this much work, you want to make sure that you save this, right? And you will be saving to the M drive, which I'll show you in just a minute. This is probably, after we're done labeling, a good time to save, so you don't lose any progress on the lab. Okay, again, 1 is yes, 0 is no. Almost done, just a couple of more. But you learned something new today. You learned how to mass recode. Again, that only works with variables that are all organized the same way. If they are not organized the same way, it will not work. You will get errors from SPSS because it'll say, hey, you told me to apply this logic to this set of numbers that it doesn't have, and I don't know what to do. So you don't want to run into that. That will slow you down and definitely spend your time. Okay, last one for me. And again, if you wanted to pause or stop, you are welcome to do that. Or fast forward me. I'll never know. Okay, so everything should be labeled correctly. Now let's go run frequency. Our frequency is going to make a lot more sense that everything is run, and then I'll show you how to save this. So let's go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and Frequencies. Okay, so the nice part is all of our variables we just recoded are now at the bottom, so we can just go right down there. Okay, scroll all the way down. And again, I'm going to make this a little bigger so we can see it easier. And we're going to start right here with painted graffiti. And you can highlight all the way down because we just made all of those. We're going to pop all of those variables into the variable list, and we're going to click OK. All right, so here we have recoded variables that are basically just collapsed versions of our original variables. Okay, so again, we can go back into these individual variables and check them to make sure they were recoded correctly. So let's do that with our very first variable. So graffiti, we had 542 yeses and 5,906 nos. If we go back to our original frequency on painting graffiti, we can see that we did have 5,906 nos, and if we get our calculator, we should be able to sum the rest of these together into the number of yeses, right? So we have 392 plus 80 plus 70. There's 542 right there. And down here, there's 542. So we know that we recoded that variable correctly. Now again, if you wanted to be super thorough, you could go ahead and check every single variable to make sure it recoded properly. But again, we applied the same logic and the same coding scheme to all of these variables. So it's kind of like the idea of sampling. If we quality check one and we applied the very same logic and the same coding scheme to all of them, then we can be pretty confident that it worked out just fine for the rest of these variables. We didn't receive any errors in the output, so we should be fine that they all were summed together. So do you see the difference of what we made? So we started out with variables that had categories that were kind of broken down into once or twice, 3 or 4, 5 or more, and we basically just collapsed all of those responses into basically a yes response of saying, did you do it? I don't care how many times you did it. If you did it, I'm going to say, yes, you did it. And that's what we have. So now all of these variables, as we have collapsed them, and again, that's a researcher choice, are now ready to be scaled. Okay, but I promised you I would tell you how to do a save to save all this precious work you've done in this lab so far. So let's go ahead and we will just kind of move this output to the side. What you'll do is you'll go into back in your variable view, go to File, and then Save As, and you click your drop down, and you're going to scroll up to student file storage. You'll also see your GatorLink credential in there. This is permanent student file storage for you to use. So there's my name. I'm going to go to the M drive, student file storage, and you can save anywhere in here that you want to. Okay? So you can save this file. You can put it right here in the middle. You don't have to go to desktop or documents. You can stick it right here and hit save, and you can even put Lab 7, so you remember this was your data that you were working on for Lab 7. So if in case you had to kind of do this lab in parts, you could go open this lab where you left off, navigating to the M drive, and all of your stuff will be there. Okay, so saving to the M drive is really important because the research drive, the Common Files R drive, gets wiped every night. So if you were to continue this lab tomorrow, you'd find that all 15 of these variables would be gone the next day. And that's pretty discouraging once you've labeled and recoded everything. So now you know how to save your work, whether you're doing a lab or working on your final paper. Okay? So in the next video, I'll show you how to put all these variables into a scale. We'll see you at that point.